joining me on stage now. Nancy will be coming back here. We'll also be joined by Asha Jaffer. I don't see where she is. Oh, there you are, Asha. So Asha is a journalist and communication professional. Let me sit down so that she can join me. She's a journalist and communications professional. She's contributed to international and local media. And in 2014, she won the Special Award for the Hala Prize for Development Journalism. She's also worked as an assistant producer, translator, and editor for Clearwater Productions and for the Foreign Correspondents Association of East Africa. She was born and raised in Kibera. For those of you who might not be Kenyan and know, it's one of the biggest informal settlements in Africa. And she's currently managing the award-winning initiative, Kibra Food Drive and Initiative. Round of applause for her. What an impressive lady. And in fairness for the genders, we also have Professor George Nyabuga, Prof. There he is. He's an associate professor of media and journalism at the Aga Khan University's Graduate School of Media and Communications and the coordinator of the Executive Masters in Media Leadership and Innovation program. He taught at the University of Nairobi for more than 12 years before joining the Aga Khan University. Professor Nyabuga, also a former colleague, has also taught journalism and media and cultural studies at the University of Worcester and international media and communication and comparative politics at Coventry University, both in the United Kingdom. He worked as a journalist before joining academia, so he's very well versed with what we're talking about. It's not just theories for him. And his last positions in the media were managing editor in charge of weekend editions and managing editor media convergence at the Standard Group. Round of applause to our panel. So I think, Prof, let's start with you. Perhaps your initial thoughts on Nancy's presentation, and if you have any striking remarks. Mic for Prof? Yeah.
Hello.
Yes.
Oh, very well. Thanks, Edith, and thanks, Nancy, for those remarks. And I was listening to them and asking myself various other questions. Is the world really flat? I think that question still occupies us because there's a lot of conspiracy theories that are flying around. And the other issue of public interest for private gain. And I think we are seeing a lot of this, especially as media struggle to become sustainable, become viable. And I think the report or the research that was conducted by MIC, and colleagues at the university show that struggle is real. And it's putting a lot of pressure on the media to try as much as possible to write or to broadcast stories that make sense to people. But stories, unfortunately, that seek to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And we know what that means. I think there is an obsession with profitability, an obsession to develop stories that would sell. And, you know, that commodification of news, I think, has become fairly serious in the recent past. And the various issues that we're looking at is journalism still good enough? Is it fit for purpose? I would dare say that, you know, I think seen or looked at very critically, journalism still makes sense.
Prof, can I just jump in there? Because
yes.
There's a question that was asked. I think Nancy is the one who introduced it, or was it Mora? What is journalism? Because even that definition seems to be evolving.
Yes. You know, as a professional journalist, I think journalism is a profession that renders, you know, or reports on issues from a professional perspective. That they've got the expert knowledge to be able to collect information that is relevant, that resonates with people's needs, rather than any content that you know is seemingly interesting to people. But at the same time, sometimes we ask ourselves, what is really people? Are people homogeneous, or do we want to appeal to as many people as possible, given the different needs of the people, and consequently the gratifications that we seek to fulfill are based on different needs. But let me just jump back to something that I wanted to say. That, as journalists seek to write all these compelling stories, they're sometimes actually faced with existential matters. And when we look at the media in East Africa, and I'll refer to the Nation Media Group, which is one of the biggest, and it's in Kenya and Uganda, so many of us can relate to that. I think in the recent past, we've seen them downscaling. That means that they've gotten rid of so many journalists, experienced journalists, and consequently hiring journalists that are not very expensive, in the sense that they don't have to pay them much. And that then leaves a group of sort of inexperienced journalists that do not possess the knowledge and the experience to really cover, very serious issues. And when I look at, for example, COP27, and if you ask many of those journalists covering those events whether they understand what COP27 is and what even COP just stands for, many of you might not tell you what it is. Instead, they'll be looking for news on why, for instance, Biden or the new Prime Minister, UK Prime Minister, is not attending, and what that means in the context of, global warming or climate change, or chasing sometimes influencers because that is what they think people would be interested in. And as such, the very, very serious issues, they probably not have an idea. And that means that they are then unable to actually break down these issues of climate change, other than perhaps drought and politics surrounding climate change. And apparently that's what people might privilege. And as such, we see such simplistic content rather than the very serious content, because this is apparently what people privilege, or what they think people actually want, without necessarily understanding the audience needs, the audience, what the audience really, wants in the context of climate change. So, when we look at East Africa, the drought that is affecting this part of the world, what does it mean? Is it just climate change? Is it because of the bad politics that we see? Is it because of lack of investment in mitigating the climate change issues? Or is it just, the kind of relationships that we want to see around the world? Is it politics? Because apparently that's what many people would want to see. And looking at my own experience, where I was always asked to sell the newspapers rather than maybe write or present news that would actually help the country. So every headline that we had was about a particular political actor rather than the issues. So it would be he said, sort of she said, news rather than very complex matters, because ordinary people sometimes do not possess the knowledge and the expertise to understand that. So sometimes we might ask ourselves, what is the solution to some of this? Is it because we lack training? Is it because we lack the resources? Or is it because we lack the interest to do that? And even this very experienced journalists, and I've suggested this many times, that universities develop courses that would have a joint honors, if you may. So it would be a joint honors, say, in climate change or environmental issues and journalism, rather than just studying journalism and trying then to make sense of the issues that people are tackling. And let me give just one example to illustrate that point. Many years ago, I and colleagues from Makerere University, especially George Lugarambi, who will be here at some point, did a report, across Africa, looking at why it is that scientists and people that were interested in technology did not want to engage with journalists. And that is a conclusion that we came up with. So it was not a preconceived idea that they did not want to engage with journalists. And one of the key findings is that scientists and doctors and technology experts sometimes did not want to talk to journalists because they did not want to be misreported, because the journalists did not go in there with the expert knowledge. They might research on issues, but unless they come with that expert knowledge to ask relevant questions, and I think that is what Nancy referred to, what kind of questions are people or the journalists asking? And if you do not ask the right questions, it means that you get the wrong answer. I remember one time a senior politician in Kenya walking out of an interview because the interviewer, or he felt that the interviewer was not asking relevant questions, and actually said it on air. So what does that mean to the quality of journalists that we have in parts of East Africa?
Yeah.
And I don't want to say that journalism does not still make sense. As many people have said, journalism is critical to the way we understand the world that is beyond our sensory experience. Journalism is important to key issues relating to democracy, relating to climate change, relating to the relationship around the world, relating to conflict. Is the kind of journalism that we practice that sometimes is off-putting, and consequently we might feel that young people are not interested in the kind of journalism that we see. They will be interested in journalism if those stories resonate with the ideas, resonate with the issues that they feel passionate about.
Okay, let me ask Asha then, because this is something that you've repeated more than once, Professor, that as professionals, we should be somehow aware of what our audiences want. But the truth is, we don't even have audiences these days. Who are our audiences? So Asha, my question to you is, what does community model journalism teach us about how we can invert this model?
I think the first understanding is looking at the communities and not assuming that they're uneducated, unknowledgeable, and uninnovative. Because the assumption has always been that, let's say where I grew up, most people are not talented enough to tell their own stories. So you'd find there's no collaboration between the people in the community and the people in the mainstream media. So you'd find like someone would come to an informal settlement and write a story without having the facts or speaking to, like local journalists in the area, and then they go and report, and there's always a clash of the middle class and the lower class of, misrepresentation of poverty and what it actually means. So that is the first thing, because then my problem has always been with the Kenyan media particularly, like when they go to most informal settlements or the rural area, they write from their own perspectives. And sometimes you have blind spots. Like I grew up in an informal settlement. If I go to Karen, I cannot represent Karen issues.
Karen being a high posh area.
Yeah. Yeah, I cannot represent current issues in a very good light. So I'd need to either like live there for a while or collaborate with someone from there or even like read about it. But sometimes the information that we find online is not always like we know, like it's not always what is represented on the ground. So yeah, I think it has to be like a collaboration needs to happen between the mainstream and the local, but then there needs to be trust, because people distrust or mistrust people in such areas because the first assumption is they're unknowledgeable. And I think that is the problem.
Yeah.
Because just because someone lives in a rural area or in an informal settlement does not mean they're uneducated or uninformed or uninnovative. It just means that maybe they didn't get the chances to opportunities to actually move, or get some of these jobs or explore to other avenues. So if people cut out all these stereotypes, I think there can be a collaboration between the communities, because even when you speak about how Africa is represented in the Western media, this is the same struggle with how people in the informal sectors or informal in Kenya, think of how the mainstream media in Kenya represents them. So there's a clash, and this needs to be integrated, but people need to trust each other and believe that there's some good in every community you go to, and you need to trust the people.
Yeah. Okay, so Nancy, back to you, because recently I was in Turkana, where similarly to you, I did find a lady there who was very well versed with the indigenous issues around climate change. She just didn't have the language that I'm using to express that. But in speaking to a journalist who was covering the same issues, she said there's just too much pressure on journalists. You're expected to be the expert, you're expected to break down this stuff to the local communities. Is it practical for us to take on so much, or should we be investing in what Asha is saying, more collaborative approaches? And if so, how do we do that if academia don't even trust us to relay that information accurately?
I think there's a thread that runs through all of the questions here, which is, what is the journalist's role? Because, here we have expert, here we have member of the community, here, because they can tell the story from the inside. Here we have someone who understands the issues. But if that is the case, then should we just not get medical doctors and train them how to write and report on issues of medicine? Or should we not just get pilots to report on flying? So what is it that the journalist does? And I think perhaps the space we are in is a journalist is an aggregator, is a passer of meaning from information. And in a situation where you have a journalist coming into a context that is not theirs, I mean, that's another big question. Who has the right to tell a story? So if I tell the story of Kibera, it will look different from the way that you will tell it. Does that mean I should never tell it? And does the world lose something if we only ever hear one perspective from that perspective of the people who are centered? And I think the problem is that the centering has been on the people from the outside rather than the people on the inside. But maybe the solution is not to reverse that and now shut out the people from the outside and center only the people on the inside. Maybe it's about being honest about whose perspective is this and where is it coming from. So if I write a story about Kibera, I should be aware that I'm coming from this perspective, and maybe that should come through in my reporting. So people should understand, I have never lived there, I don't understand that. And the reason I say this is because I grew up in Tanzania. And the first time I came to Uganda, my parents are Ugandan, but the first time I came here, the thing that struck me is the soil is red. And I kept telling people, the soil is red. And they're like, what are you talking about? It's not red. But that's what I mean. When we live in something, there are things that we don't see. Similarly, when you live outside something, there are things you don't see. So I think we need to benefit from different perspectives. But it's really important, as Asha says, to center the right perspectives within a narrative.
So where's the fine balance, Professor? Because now I'm thinking of my colleague, Mario Muller, who is German, working out of Nairobi. There are questions she can ask which I cannot. There are rooms she can get into that I cannot. However, if that is perpetuated eternally, then the story becomes, well, Germans are telling African stories. Where's the balance, Professor?
As I try and respond to that question, Edith, let me refer to what I think Asha talked about, stereotypes. And I mention this because one of the things that has been created in the minds of, I still say, audiences around the world is that Kibera is an informal settlement. I actually partly grew up in Kibera. Yeah? It's not all informal settlement. I went to Olympic Primary School. I stayed in Olympic.
Asha is very surprised.
And that is still Kibera. Langata is just across the road. So Kibera is not all informal settlement. There are very good stories that come out of Kibera. And lots of, innovative stuff. So I think the problem, and especially around the world, is when a German journalist, for example, comes to Kenya and want an informal settlement, the first thing they'll do is go to Kibera because they've been told that the poorest of the Nairobi people live in Kibera. Crime is in Kibera. All these challenges are in Kibera without knowing that there are positive stories out of Kibera. And that's why I think we keep talking about constructive journalism. How can we portray Kibera in a positive way rather than what we are used to? And I think that's the kind of balance that we need, without romanticizing poverty, without romanticizing living in an informal settlement. Because I found that if you say that you live or you grew up in an informal settlement, you're sort of embraced because you are, what it is that these maybe journalists expect out of that situation. So I think the media sometimes is used to perpetuate some of these myths and some of these fallacies. And consequently, to create that balance, it is important to understand what are the stories that resonate with people, what are the people issues without, for instance, around election time, for instance, in Kenya, people, BBC and CNN and all these global media expect violence to come out of Kenya without knowing that people are resilient. People, after 2007, 2008 post-election violence, they don't want violence anymore. There might be violence. I mean, we see the same in the US, but it might not be the same kind of violence. The African violence is seen as perhaps being very different. So it's a matter of balancing sometimes soft stories and hard stories. But of course, the ability of the journalist is they possess the expert knowledge to be able to break this information down to make it understandable, to make it accessible to as many people as possible. And making it accessible means that it is interesting, it's compelling, it's meaningful, and it's impactful to the communities that are watching it or consuming it, just to use that word. And I think that's the kind of balance that what people want to see, not stories about poverty all the time, stories about death, and I think those are off-putting. People have suffered so many challenges that they do not want to see that anymore. The other thing that I wanted to mention quickly is and I think Nancy actually put it out very clearly, the utilization of local or native or indigenous knowledge.
Yeah.
The moment you talk to that woman that has over time experienced some of these issues, and she speaks the local language and she connects with those local people, I think people would appreciate that kind of story a lot more, rather than putting an expert, someone who's come to Uganda, and perhaps a researcher worked here for 2 months and they pretend to be an expert on Ugandan matters. I think that might appeal to some sort of community, but at the end of the day, people might not connect with that kind of information that is shared by that expert that has just parachuted in and consequently pretends to understand local issues. So let's utilize these local experts who might not speak English, who might not speak German, but they can speak the local language. And let's appreciate that that local knowledge is important in the context of journalism, that matters in the context of journalism, that ought to appeal, and this is fairly normative, ought to appeal to as many people as possible, and especially the locals. So I sort of appreciate the fact that utilization of that is important. The other thing is collaborative efforts. When BBC sometimes flies in, of course, you have the fixers and things like that. But oftentimes, and maybe Nancy, when she was talking about experience in Madagascar, I know that you use a lot of those local people, but sometimes you go in there and you pretend that you are the experts, you're the people that know, and consequently, you want to tell it from the lens of the BBC rather than from the lens of the local people. There's a difference, of course, between BBC and others, because BBC has that African segment and want to, to do stories from that perspective. But Western media sometimes forget that these local experts are actually experts, despite the fact that they may not have gone to school. There's a lot of indigenous knowledge that needs to come out.
Okay, Asha, actually, this is a better question for you, Nancy, because you are working for the BBC. I've often heard it said that, Western media criticize quite a lot because of the whole whitewashing situation. But is it really our job as employees from Africa to be ambassadors for the continent?
Well, I mean, that's a question I asked myself in my career at the BBC. What do I want to uphold and represent? And for me, the answer is, I suppose, ambitious, but my goal would be to show the world as it is, to look at the world with both eyes open. So I cannot close one eye and pretend this isn't happening. But it comes back to that idea of due impartiality. So if there has been an imbalance, then there needs to be a correction. So if there has been nothing but negative stories, then perhaps people need to see some positive, because that will balance their view on the world. There is no point in having people believe that there is nothing in Africa but monkeys in caves, because that is not the truth. And that does not help our world if we do not understand what is true. And so if I can tell more stories that will help people to balance their view of the world, then that's what I should do. But at the same time, it doesn't mean I ignore things that are happening, things that may be negative, that may be impacting communities, that if those stories were shared, they would actually help people. So I think it really is about taking a very measured approach to try and say, what is off kilter here? What needs correcting? It's not an easy thing, but I certainly think that we have to face up to the fact that there are only a few global outlets. There are not many. And if we don't have a voice in those outlets, then we are going to be talked about and not talked for or talked to. So I do think it's important. It's a huge responsibility. I'm not sure I get it right all the time, but I think it's a continuous learning. And the more you speak to people and stay engaged, I think the better you can do. But it's not an easy challenge.
Yeah, agreed. We have 6 minutes left on the clock. I'd like to open the floor to the audience. If you have any questions, this is your moment. Anyone with a question so far? Oh, okay. There we go. And we've got another question there.
Hi. Oh, hello. I have a question for Asha. I'm curious because I know you do a lot of work in the community as an activist, both running the Kibera food drive as well as your work with the Kibera Girls Soccer Academy. And I'm curious how being so visibly present as an activist and as a member of the community driving change within it, how does that impact your work as a journalist? Because somebody who, you hear journalists have to be distant and kind of stay out of it in order to capture the truth. What changes when you're physically in the space making direct change and you're telling stories about the same space?
We can get Asha's answer and then we'll go to the second question.
I think it depends with the media outlet you work with. Sometimes because I'm known for the activism work I do, not particularly in Kibera, but in Kenya, speaking about a few issues. And sometimes you go and interview a person and the first face they see is the activism face and not the journalism face, even though I'm a trained journalist and I went to uni for it.
But let me jump in a little bit because Nancy did ask, is it possible to have that divide between activism and journalism?
I think for me, journalism is just activism, but in a more, you use cameras and you use laptops and other avenues to tell your stories. But when people see activism, they think it's going to the streets and chanting and with placards and other things. But activism is just speaking the truth. It's basically being truthful. And if you're a journalist and you're truthful, then other people will be like, is Nancy an activist or a journalist? So sometimes there's always that conflict of, is this person really what we're used to in journalism of going by the book or what you're told and not going against it. Because we've seen journalists going, let's say Larry Madowo is a good example of a journalist who's an activist, and also you go on TV, you read a whole statement by the economic fighters from South Africa, speaking about something that is really painful to most Africans. I think that's journalism. So there's a way to marry the two. It's just that when you go to interview people, you have to be aware that is this audience looking at me as an activist or a journalist? And then you do the work of making them see that what I'm doing here is journalism, and activism will come, through other avenues. So it's my duty to do that every time. But it's difficult because journalism is frowned upon in some spaces in Kenya, and you're seen as a troublemaker. And it's not really as fun as, I'd say.
Can I just, Edith, let me just respond quickly in addition to what Asha said. And I think Nancy said it, that as a journalist, you're not sometimes expected to be completely detached with the issues that you face. As long as you explain to your audiences and your audience understand that these are issues that you feel very passionate about. So if you're in Kibra and want to, understand and deeply understand the issues because you live in there and you understand what it is that people, face, there will be no problem. If you, reporting on those issues because you understand them and the people that you are interviewing or talking to, you understand them, you understand what it is that they represent. So the journalism of detachment, I think it's all journalism, if you may. It's what Martin Bell, Nancy, your old colleague, said, it's a bystander sort of journalism, that you want to experience Kibra from afar and say, that is the story there. I'm not part of it, but that is the story.
Is the curricula, for example, at Aga Khan University being changed to reflect this? Because one of the key rules that I suppose we need to investigate is lack of the use of I when reporting. So should we then perhaps not insert ourselves, but be transparent, as Nancy said, about our participation in it?
I think journalism from an academic perspective, and we actually give journalism students the knowledge to understand that this is journalism ought to be practiced. What changes is when you leave university or when you leave college and join the newsroom and discover that the cultures within that newsroom expect you to operate in a particular way. And these are the expectations, and these are the stories. So we provide the knowledge that is necessary to practice as a journalist, but the newsroom dynamics are very different. And that is, I think, what determines and influences how people operate. But I think in the recent past, we've started to develop courses that, look at journalism from a constructivism way, rather than, it being sort of objective journalism as we understood it. I think journalism as part of a solution to society, or providing solutions to society rather than just reporting on issues and letting people make up their mind or decide what is useful or not.
Okay. I'd like Simon to give me 5 more minutes, please. Do I have a thumbs up from him? I cannot see him, and so I will grab the 5 minutes. You can have your question. Please, the gentleman had raised his hand first. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more, but our guest will be here with us, and you can ask him the questions.
All right, thank you very much. My name is Arnold Button, and my question is to Nancy. My main concern with BBC and CNN and Fox and all those Western news platforms is they tend to give us a revised view of certain incidences. For example, the Ukraine and Russia war. We were given a story about how Russia is bad. They painted Russia bad, but I never saw any journalist from those platforms investigating why we still have the ambassador of Russia in America and the ambassador of America in Russia, given all the things that were done, and they were said we are going to stop selling to Russia and what, but all that. And then COVID-19, you kept on telling us how many people are dying, but it is always in the negative, it is always painting a bad picture. Why is it like that? Because I've followed news. I always do make time and follow the BBC, then watch Al Jazeera, then watch CNN. But at the end of the day, I find there's something for them as them that they want to show the world that they leave out. For us who really want to know everything, we never get to know unless you dig deep and find it out for yourself.
All right, thanks for your question.
Okay, first of all, I'll start by saying that is your opportunity as young journalists to fill some of those gaps. News by nature is a curative process. You're looking at all the stories we could have today and saying, of all these stories, which ones are we going to tell? And within that process, decisions are made. The BBC covers the entire world. There's no way they can tell all the stories from Uganda that matter, all the stories from Kenya that matter. And that's just a selection process. I know you have a question about editorial agenda as well. I think on that, it comes back to that question that I raised earlier, is does all journalism have an agenda? And I think as long as you have certain principles, you do have an agenda. So I don't think it's a deliberate attempt, but there is often systemic practice. And there is no perfect system. I think the best system is one that can adapt and change when it is corrected. So I think it is important that we do correct these systems with our feedback, as you were giving, with our suggestions, by starting up new enterprises that challenge some of the old narratives. But fundamentally, people like to say news is about planes crashing, not planes landing. You'll never see a headline that says Kenya Airways has landed. If Kenya Airways crashes, that will be news. So sadly, there is an inherent negativity because that's what people will be interested in, and that's what people will read. And I think Professor touched on this, that it's a vicious cycle of, because people are clicking on this, we give them more. And so how do you introduce systems that balance some of those narratives? So it is a good question, and I would say maybe there is an opportunity in there to fill the gaps that others leave.
Said. So we've got a minute left, and I'd like to ask my panel very unfairly to just say to me in a yes or no answer. The question today is not whether journalism is good, but whether it's good enough. And looking at the context of the East African region, based on your assessment on what's unfolding, is it good enough? Prof, yes or no?
I don't think it's a question of black and white.
Come on, I knew you were going to push back. I just need a yes or no. We have 42 seconds.
There's a lot of very good journalism out there.
Okay.
And there's a lot of bad journalism.
That tells us nothing. Nancy.
Begin with, I'll end there.
Okay, to begin with, hauna maoni, no opinions there.
Yeah, we try.
Okay. Everybody is a little shy to go all the way, but maybe at the end of the conference we'll have an answer. Asha, Jaffer, Nancy Kacungira, Professor George Nyabuga, ladies and gentlemen, round of applause for them.
Thank you so much. What a wonderful panel that was. And again, setting the tone for what we know is going to be an extra special next few days. And you, as always, were incredible.
Asante sana.